Hello again, and welcome to episode 3 of Double Feature Reviews. I'm Libby.
I'm David.
And today we're talking about The Portrait of a Lady, not Portrait of a Lady on Fire. I know that gets confusing for some people. And Dangerous Liaisons. So we had watched Dangerous Liaisons together a couple of years ago. I had never seen The Portrait of a Lady.
I'd never seen Portrait of a Lady.
Never seen Portrait of a Lady.
Henry James is a very well-respected author. Have you read The Portrait of a Lady, the book?
I have not read the novel. I've read some other Henry James. I've read Washington Square and The Turn of the Screw. And I have read the novel Dangerous Liaisons in English translation.
I see. I have not read Dangerous Liaisons or Portrait of a Lady. Is it Portrait of a Lady or The Portrait of a Lady? I keep getting confused.
The actual title is The Portrait of a Lady.
Yeah.
The English title of the French lesbian film, no article, is just Portrait of a Lady on Fire.
That's right.
But the Henry James novel and the film adaptation is The Portrait of a Lady.
Okay, great. So I had not read The Portrait of a Lady or any Henry James. I have seen the film adaptations of Turn of the Screw, The Innocents. I've also seen the 1949 The Heiress, which is an adaptation of Washington Square.
We watched that together.
That's right.
So, do you want to start with series title, or do I get to go first this time?
You can definitely go first.
Okay. So, before I watched these films, my initial title that I thought I would go with is John Malkovich, You Bad, Bad Boy, which I think is not an inaccurate title.
It's not wrong.
But having seen them, the slightly more academic series title that I would give them is One Scene Makes All the Difference.
Okay.
And I'll explain that as, not immediately, I'll explain that as we move along.
What a tease. Okay, I'm going with Grand Tales of Women Convincing Men to Seduce Women. It's, again, I definitely think accurate, and I think covers the core link between the films, and I guess pretty close to the theme. I might give a slightly more relaxed subtitle, Scary Love Triangles in Costume Drama Europe. I think that's the aesthetic, perhaps.
The location of Costume Drama Europe.
That basically
the
sums it
Costume
up.
Drama Europe cinematic universe.
I think that's correct.
But the scary one, where sex actually happens, not the Jane Austen one.
That's true. Are there any Jane Austen scenes on the continent, or is it entirely in Britain?
There are no Jane Austen, not in the main 6 novels, or I believe Lady Susan. I haven't read all of her juvenilia and other works, but I believe she's all Great Britain.
British through and through.
There are references to scenes in Ireland and Emma.
Someone goes to the colonies, or their boyfriend goes to the colonies.
It's a secondary character.
Okay, all right.
Stay tuned for our review of Emma coming at some point.
It is.
So I'm in charge of the metadata. The Portrait of a Lady is a 1996 film. Also, I'm reading this off of IMDb, so I am being also presented with the information that it's rated PG-13. I don't know if the rating is something we should continue to include, but we'll do it for this episode.
Sure.
It's directed by Jane Campion, who is, I would say, for neither of us, is she our favorite director. But if we were gonna score directors giving the most points to our favorite, I think Jane Campion would get the highest combined score.
Almost definitely.
Yeah. I think for both of us, she's top 5.
Yeah. I would say Jane Campion is the director that when I hear there's a new project from them coming out, I get the most excited. She is the director that excites me the most.
So if you kind of want to get ahead of our podcast, just start going through the complete works of Jane Campion. We will probably get to all of it eventually.
It's going to happen.
It stars Nicole Kidman as Isabel Archer, John Malkovich as Gilbert Osmond, Barbara Hershey as Madame Serena Merle, Martin Donovan as Ralph Touchett, and in a not particularly big role, but one that I need to shout out, Richard E. Grant as Lord Warburton, making Richard E. Grant the first person to appear in 2 episodes of this podcast. A great honor. Well done, Richard. He appeared as the footman George in Gosford Park.
Our first double feature double.
Exactly. We thought John Malkovich was going to be the first person to appear in 2 different films that we watched.
These 2 films.
That's part of why we picked them. I didn't know Richard E. Grant was in this film. And we don't see his face when he first appears. We just hear his voice. And I was like, is that Richard E. Grant?
You can tell.
Well, I had seen him so recently.
That's right. Good point. He doesn't look exactly the same. He's got a definitely more rounded face with the beard in this movie.
Yeah. Interestingly, I think he looks older in The Portrait of a Lady, even though he is younger.
Yes, he looks distinctly older.
Yeah.
And it's not like his character in Gosford Park is supposed to be aged down, but
I think it's the facial hair kind of scruffs him up.
Really changes the appearance.
And Dangerous Liaisons is a 1988 film directed by Stephen Frears. And it stars friend of the show Glenn Close as La Marquise de Merteuil, John Malkovich again as Le Vicomte de Valmont, Michelle Pfeiffer as Madame de Tourvel, Swoosie Kurtz as Madame de Volanges, which if you've seen a sort of modern remake of this film, you will also recognize Swoosie Kurtz from that. Keanu Reeves as the Chevalier d'Anceny, and Uma Thurman as Cécile de Volanges.
Swoosie Kurtz is in Cruel Intentions, to be clear.
Is she playing the same role? I've never seen...
She's Ryan Philippe's therapist, so I don't think it's the same character.
Do you want to give us a plot introduction to both of these films?
Sure. So for The Portrait of a Lady, when a 19th century woman rejects a series of wealthy suitors, her sickly friend convinces his uncle to give her a small fortune, only to see her led to Europe by a charismatic woman who manipulates her into a marriage with a controlling artist. Mm-hmm.
And you say friend. I would like to point out that he is her cousin. This is a 19th century film, or a 19th century novel. It would be impressive if it was a 19th century film. This is a 19th century story, which means first cousin romance is on the table, and you just need to get over that right now.
Yeah, the sickly friend is one of the wealthy suitors, although that's only more gradually established throughout the story. And for Dangerous Liaisons, two 18th century French aristocrats become best of frenemies, maybe with benefits, while toying with the sexual fates of a coquettish virgin and a faithful wife.
Thank you very much, David. I'm glad we've given this job over to you, because I'm terrible at summarizing anything in less time than it takes to actually experience it.
Well, The Portrait of a Lady summary is not particularly brief, and there are quite a few adjectives in there.
That's true.
Well, we're going to get to it, but I think that's actually a pretty good description of the film.
Mm-hmm. I gave him a 3-sentence limit, so...
Those are both one sentence.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So now we're going to get more into talking about the films individually. We're going to start with Portrait of a Lady, because that's the one that we watched first. We have a soft policy of, if we don't know what the correct order is going in, to watch the older film first, which we didn't do in this case because we had both already seen Dangerous Liaisons, and we wanted to give ourselves kind of some more time to process Portrait of a Lady before jumping into making a podcast. So I unfortunately do need to introduce our discussion of Portrait of a Lady by saying that we both pretty strongly disliked the film. It's not that there's nothing good about it, but the script is one of the worst scripts I have ever seen put to film.
Yeah. I think the story starts in some interesting ways and presents the setup fairly accessibly, but pretty quickly devolves into endless, impenetrable dialogue. Mm-hmm.
So, much like Madame de Merteuil in the other film, I set you a challenge, which was to figure out who was the driving force behind this film, because it's not that no film gets made by lots of apathetic people, but high-budget period dramas pretty much don't get made by a bunch of apathetic people. So I wanted to know, was Jane Campion the one who really wanted this? Was the screenwriter Laura Jones the one who really wanted this? Was there a producer or a studio head who thought this would be great? How did this film get made?
So, this is a Jane Campion blank check film.
Okay.
We are in the wake of the piano. Jane Campion has made
which won a million Oscars
of all times. Yeah. Exceptionally well acclaimed, a groundbreaking success for women directors, etc., etc. And so she goes into creating this, able to make any story she wants. Okay. And what she wants to do is film the unfilmable Henry James, The Portrait of a Lady. That's her ambition.
Okay, so she brought Laura Jones on board to write the script.
I think that's entirely possible. Campion and Jones had worked together on earlier films, including maybe Jane Campion's first big film, which is a docudrama about an artist in New Zealand. So yes, they had worked together before, and it's entirely believable that Campion is the one bringing in Laura Jones.
Okay.
So when we're saying a blank check here, now this is a 1996 blank check for a costume drama, so it's a $35 million budget, which is a pretty reasonable amount of money for that time, but it's not huge. Long story short, the film ends up making between $5 and $20 million in total international growth, and is not a financial success.
Yeah.
So this is the first film collaboration between Jane Campion and Nicole Kidman, but not their first time working together. Mm-hmm. Jane Campion had discovered Nicole Kidman at 14 in the theater and had helped her establish herself as an TV and film actress in Australia. They went on to work together several times again in The Cut and Top of the Lake Season 2, starring Nicole Kidman.
Top of the Lake China Girl.
Top of the Lake China Girl, featuring Nicole Kidman.
Which is not as good as the original Top of the Lake, but does have the immortal line, sad for the babies, happy for the money.
Top of the Lake Season 1 is really good. So that's
Top of the Lake Season 1 is the best miniseries to be filmed ever.
I have to agree.
Yeah.
Jane Campion is capable of some truly amazing work. This might be a notable exception.
Yeah.
It was not a huge critical success. Mm-hmm. Jane Campion was really popular, had a lot of momentum. I think there was an attempt to sort of appreciate it, but it received a pretty tepid response.
Yeah, I looked at the Oscar situation. It looks like Barbara Hershey got nominated, and there, I think maybe costume design got nominated, but no wins and no major awards. Does supporting actress count as a major award?
I'll leave that for you to decide.
Certainly not if you don't win it.
Fair. Barbara Hershey really picks up pretty much all of the critical acclaim for the film. Yeah. She gets nominated by a lot of different critics groups. She gets great reviews. I thought she did a really good job in the movie and produced a striking and interesting performance, but not one that could actually save the script. Nicole Kidman was really invested in the project and apparently sort of suffered a mental breakdown at the end of the production from the emotional weight that she put into embodying the tragic tale of this character and was bedridden for 2 weeks.
Oh, no.
So the problem, again, is not a lack of investment on the part of Nicole Kidman.
That's true. So let's talk about things we liked about the film.
There were a lot of good things.
This section will, however, be shorter than stuff we didn't like. So there are a lot of good performances. I think all of the actors deliver a solid performance, which is not true of Dangerous Liaisons. The costumes are, there's a lot of attention to historical accuracy, and they also look pretty nice. The sets are elaborate. They feel lived in. I do have a criticism of the sets that may come up later, but we will save that because we're being nice. I got a solid 2.5 hours of knitting done while watching this film. And the soundtrack had some good pieces.
I'd agree with all that. I think the visual language in the film is very strong and actually pretty accessible. There's some kind of clear visual metaphors that are telling what's going on in the story beyond just the dialogue and the narrative. We see people constantly filmed through bars as they're trapped by their poor choices, and we see men playing tug of war with other men while they're trying to control whatever women are around them.
Yeah, the first 2 transitional sequences in the film both depict a tug of war from not main characters, background fellas.
Yeah, I like expressive staging in movies. I particularly remember one part where Christian Bale, who we didn't mention, but does end up playing a role in the second half of the film as the
Rosier.
As Rosier, the suitor of Nicole Kidman's stepdaughter. When the evil John Malkovich isn't letting them be together, we literally see his hands pressed against the bars of a fence, trying to reach her, but blocked by life.
Semi-related, I thought that they had made good use of the space in the staging and blocking. It's more similar. You see this a lot in earlier films from the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Nowadays, most films are either shot you get an establishing shot at the beginning of the scene, and then it's cross-cutting close-ups almost the entire time. Whereas in this film, you do get some wider shots where you see people moving around the space, and the way they move is also expressive.
Yeah, I liked the visual gimmicks.
There are several things that you wouldn't expect to appear in your typical costume drama, and that are not being taken directly from the book.
Right. We open with, I think, the best part of the movie, a sort of montage of women from different historical eras, but mostly modern women sitting in a garden discussing love and life and trying to express their deepest feelings to the camera.
Before we even get to that, we start with a black screen and we just get audio of women talking about how they like to be kissed. And then this sort of, as we are cutting between different faces, we eventually end up on the face of Isabel Archer, which then starts us into the sort of flow of the movie proper.
Yeah, there's a real sense to ground the film in a feminist history and to make it a portrait of femininity and what it is to be a woman, not just a portrait of this particular woman. I'm not quite sure that's what Henry James was trying to do with the story, but we're going to get to that part later. But it is a really interesting thing to have presented to you, and it's engaging and thoughtful. I also like the big cinematic thrust that she takes, putting in these highly stylized sections as sort of an attempt to abridge sections of the novel or get us into the inner dialogue, which is always so hard to film. There's the dream sequence where she's seduced, caressed, and more by all of these men that she's rejected, sort of her wrestling with that decision and her own desire and lack of fulfillment. There's also another piece in the middle section where we see her traveling through Europe as a...
Is that the one in Egypt or a different one?
That's true. And see her travels as she's enjoying her fortune, having left America.
The film never starts. There's no American shots. It starts in England.
Isn't the opening scene where... Oh, you're right.
That's in England.
You're right.
So her parents have died. You can tell because she is wearing all black. She's in mourning. And she has gone to live with her uncle in England, played by John Gielgud.
Yeah. But there's this travel sequence in black and white, sort of as a 30s...
I would say even earlier. It looks like very early film. And if this piece had been set 20 years later, I would be like, oh, it looks like the film that would have existed at the time. It is unfortunately set in the early to mid 1870s. So just slightly before film. So that's unfortunate.
Yeah, that one's a little bit harder to dissect exactly how to interpret it. But it was interesting to look at and featured some very striking imagery. So I really liked the bold steps that were taken in the directing. And I think you mentioned that the parts of it that, the parts that you described as cartoonish were some of the best parts of the movie. And, it's considered an unfilmable novel. And for 80% of it, we're just given basically words from the page dialogue. Yeah. Although not enough of it to fully follow the story, that doesn't really stand out compared to any other costume drama. I think if Jane Campion had done more inventive cinematography throughout the film and had established that as a way to present these ideas and feelings from the characters that are hard to depict by just seeing people walking around and talking to each other, not only would the film have been more interesting, but it would have actually been easier to understand. Yeah. So I think, the avant-garde parts are what's good. And I wanted more of that.
Yeah, we've basically described all of them. I think there were 2 black and white sequences, which are of her traveling around. But there's basically just 4 sort of weird 2-minute sections that stand out. And I definitely would have liked more, especially when I saw the caressing scene, where I was like, Henry James did not write this in his book. There is not an orgy in a Victorian novel. I would know about it. So I was like, oh, we're going to be making these cuts a lot, and that's going to explain what's going on. And then we had no more of them throughout the film.
I feel like all of those sequences give us a lot of context about the literary theme and the internal thoughts of the characters, and then they go away. We stop getting them. And I think there's other things that are avant-garde and interesting. Like we mentioned, all the visual metaphors. I also liked how we often see when people are trying to force Miss Archer into things she doesn't want to do, they're chaining up a horse or holding a dog up by his legs while he's complaining. And so, the parts where it says, hey, we're going to present you something that brings the idea and the feelings of this thing to life in a way that you can experience visually, those parts are all great. But they're actually pretty scarce in the film. I guess we've done a bad job of sticking to only the good things, so maybe we're going to have to move on at this point.
There were about 8 minutes that we liked, and then there was the rest of it.
They were the most unique minutes of the film, which I guess is a compliment. It's certainly intended that way.
So what went so bloody wrong? I will say, I don't think it is clear enough to say that the plot is confusing. There's several plot threads, arguably too many, and I would be interested to see this adapted in like a mini series where you've got maybe 5 or 6 hours instead of 2.5. That still might not be successful, but I'd be interested to see an attempt. Any individual scene is fine, and all of the no plot threads get dropped particularly. Actually, that's not true. Plot threads do get dropped. It's not that hard to figure out what the people are doing. Who is interested in marrying whom, who is actually married to whom, what are the relationships between these people, what country are we in. It's not completely incomprehensible. But I still found it really hard to get into, isn't even strong enough of a word. I found it really hard to follow the story because it just feels like none of these plot threads are leading into actually telling a story. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think, I haven't read the book, but I definitely get the sense that it's more of it's a description of someone's interpersonal life in a way that isn't necessarily that interesting as a step-by-step, event-by-event narrative story. So I don't know that the source material is a really, really interesting story. Maybe it is more than is showed in the film. It's supposed to be about an interesting set of characters.
Yeah, Henry James didn't have a strong plot concept when he started writing.
I've read that he basically just invented the character of Isabel Archer and then came up with a story that he thought would show off this character well. The Isabel Archer character is also really different in the movie than she is in the book. In the book, she's this really brave, idealistic, really individualistic person who has sort of these intellectual pretensions. And that's not part of the story at all.
Yeah, I would have loved to see that.
I think that would actually have been an interesting way to portray it. But the Campion version is more a sort of timid, reserved, modest woman who just wants these men to leave her alone. I've gathered that the Henry James purists are not particularly pleased with the movie. Partially because the Isabel Archer character is so much flatter, I think, and maybe less interesting. And, Jane Campion movies are by and large about men trying to control women and about their struggles to express themselves as individuals. And that's a great theme to make movies about. That's something that people are really interested in, and Jane Campion is really great at telling those stories. I don't think The Portrait of a Lady is actually a story about that.
Yeah.
She is a sort of idealistic woman who wants the perfect relationship and also wants to be totally independent, and she can't just have it all, says Henry James. And
in fact, she has neither.
That's right. And so her attempt to sort of be both a modern woman and to have her personal needs fulfilled leads her to actually losing everything and becoming the exact type of person she was afraid she was going to become. Now, I don't know that that's like a super inspirational Jane Campion story that she wants to tell. And so I could understand her not wanting to bring that same theme to the film. But then what is this film about? Because if what you're doing is just telling us the things that happen in the book, event by event, it's not actually that interesting or that easy to follow. And so if we take away...
Especially if you have a different main character than the one was in the book.
Yeah. There's also... It's tricky, I think, to make it into a film. The Ralph Tuchet character.
Rafe Tuchet.
Rafe, that's right, of course.
He actually has an American accent. It's not totally clear what the situation is there. I'm assuming Rafe's mother was American, and she married Mr. Tuchet, an Englishman. Rafe presumably grew up in America, and that's why he has an American accent?
I think in the book, it is Rafe who sort of brings Miss Archer to England with him and says, oh, you've been orphaned, why don't you come live with me and my wealthy family in England? So I think, he is transatlantic. Yeah. But in the book, so the story of the film is partially about Isabel Archer gradually realizing that maybe Rafe is her soulmate, and whether they're supposed to be romantically or sexually linked, they really are best friends, and that she should have really invested more in their relationship, especially because he's dying. He's obviously dying of tuberculosis throughout the movie, and he dies 3/4 of the way through it.
Oh, he is much closer to the end, I think.
Is it at the end? Okay, well.
Yeah, it's maybe the third sequence from the end.
He's coughing the whole time. He's not doing good.
Yeah, I mean, tuberculosis kills you pretty slowly, so the film spans several years, and he's alive for almost all of it.
So in the book, a big part of it is that he's sort of homely, and he's not super buff, and he's not super pretty.
Yeah.
And
I think there's also the question of, like, he could drop dead at any moment, which on the one hand is sad, but I'm not exactly sure what perspective I'm taking here. I think if I was writing the novel, and maybe this is included in the novel, I would include an idea from Rafe's perspective that, why don't you just marry me, Isabel? Like, I'll be dead in 10 years, and then you can go marry somebody else.
Yeah, I think that would be
live the life you want.
A really interesting and substantive part to have in the story. I don't know if it's in the book, but yeah. So in the book, he's specifically described as sort of homely, slightly ugly. He's not super charismatic and outgoing.
Yeah, they gave him a kind of ugly hairstyle.
And so that's sort of meant to sort of explain, well, no, Isabel Archer wants Mr. Dreamboat. And so she's foolishly, in Henry James' eyes, going off looking for Mr. Dreamboat instead of looking for the nice boy she already has. In the movie...
Richard E. Grant and Viggo Mortensen, also not Mr. Dreamboat.
Yeah, in the movie, I think Richard E. Grant, the original suitor, intentionally plays a sort of stuffy, not particularly attractive character. But
stuffy British lord.
Yeah.
The archetype.
Martin Donovan, I don't know if he's supposed to be attractive, but he has a very magnetic presence. And has a really strong, he's very charismatic in the film. And so why she's not interested in him appears to be that she just doesn't feel like she wants a sexual relationship. Or
I think also she feels like they're friends. And so like she's kind of already got him in her collection, and she can acquire something else by marrying someone more interesting.
So yeah, that sort of controversy about, should you go with the person you have, or should you go with someone that's your ideal? That's not really expressed in the movie at all. And it's especially difficult then to understand why Nicole Kidman sort of suddenly and totally falls for the John Malkovich character, Osmond.
Yeah. I think they do establish that we're not really covering that element in the film. And that's also something that it has in common with earlier films. If you watch a lot of like 30s, 40s, and 50s rom-coms, they're mostly not about how two characters fall in love. They pretty quickly get to, well, these people are in love, and here's the problem that presents for them. Thinking of something like American in Paris, very, very problematic in its portrayal of flirtation, but eventually and possibly illogically, they are in love by like a third of the way through the film, but they're both kind of involved with other people, and that's the problem. In modern rom-coms, we're much more likely to see the story is, how do these people fall in love? And if you're used to watching modern films, going and watching Golden Age films can be sort of like, wait, when did these people fall in love? I don't believe that they're in love. So there is a scene between Serena, Barbara Hershey's character, who we haven't talked enough about yet because we're kind of still in the first 20 minutes of the film, between Serena and Osmond, John Malkovich's character, where she has told him to go try to marry Isabel, and she says, how's it going? And he says, I'm working on it. And I took that scene as telling us The relationship is progressing. He is actually making moves, and that's not what the story is about, so we're not going to portray it. So I wasn't bothered. Maybe the film would have been better if we had seen how Isabel is seduced by Osmond, but it wasn't necessary for it to be a good film.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that John Malkovich is probably the least liked part of the film by critics. And
especially because he was kind of replaying his character from Dangerous Liaisons, which is why we paired these two together.
Clearly cast in The Portrait of a Lady because he basically was supposed to have played the same character in Dangerous Liaisons. But yeah, a lot of people said that he was really uncharming in the film, and they couldn't understand why Nicole Kidman's character would ever have been charmed by him. And
I mean, externally, he is like an artist. That's kind of interesting. I wasn't bewildered by her deciding to marry him. I mean, obviously, it's a bad choice that we can see externally, but I didn't think it was impossible for her to make that choice internally.
Yeah, in the book, it's sold where he is this sort of hyper-intellectual guy who knows everything about art, and that is what brings her in. I think the Barbara Hershey character is definitely the best acted part of the film. And the moment where Nicole Kidman first meets her, she walks in to see Barbara Hershey playing the piano. Serena playing the piano quite beautifully. Of course, it's not actually Barbara Hershey.
You don't have to do everything, Barbara.
It was a cool point to see her walk into this Nicole Kidman walk into the room and just immediately be sort of awestruck and totally taken in. And it's sort of implied that she maybe has finally found her dream man sitting here in the parlor.
Yeah.
And it's actually, she just really likes this lady playing piano.
I don't know if you have the same experience. Maybe this is just a me thing. But we see, so Serena has been invited to Isabel's uncle's house. Is that the situation? That's right. So we see her walking around her uncle's house, and she hears in another room this piano being played beautifully. And I assumed that it was a man playing it.
Of course.
Did you also make that assumption?
Well, yes, we've just seen Isabel and her. She's rejected 3 suitors,
so
maybe we found the one.
Yeah, we've pretty much only seen her interact with men. She
right.
maybe shares 2 lines with her aunt, but these suitors and her uncle are the only people she's talked to. And then we see, wait, other women do exist. And while watching the film, that starts off a maybe 10-minute sequence about their friendship. During which I did say, lesbian kiss or I walk.
Did you walk?
So we got a cheek kiss,
okay.
which was enough to make me stay,
right.
but was not enough to content me.
All right.
And I'm kind of like, would this film have been better if it was about them being in love?
So
it would have been different, which I feel like any difference has to be an improvement.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier that you thought it would be good as an 8-hour miniseries, and I could definitely see that working. I'd like to see it as a shorter film where we condense characters and combine them together, which is a common thing that is necessary to adapt novels.
Yeah, this really gave me that perspective. I feel like when books get adapted to novels, changes do happen, and a lot of times people who love the books are like, they cut this plot thread, they cut this character, they combine these 2 characters into one. It's so awful. And watching this film, I was like, boy, did we need to cut some plot threads. This movie would be so much better if Lord Warburton, for example, wasn't in it.
Yeah, well, I think if it was 20 or 30 minutes shorter, and if specifically her 3 wealthy suitors, I can't even remember their names now, but
Warburton, Goodwood is Viggo Mortensen, I think?
Is
and
Viggo
Rafe.
Mortensen. Yes. If they were all one character, and perhaps to your point, if Osmond and Serena were one character, I think it would be better. Because,
well, I mean, a pretty important element of the plot then wouldn't work. The fact that they have a child together.
Yes.
It's a science fiction film, and they spontaneously budded a child.
Yeah, the ultimate reveal that
it was bad.
Osmond's daughter is not from his late first wife, but actually from an adulterous affair with Barbara Hershey, who Nicole Kidman thought was her friend, does not make it a better movie.
Yeah.
And if we had just found out that the daughter was not from his wife, but from some affair. Mm-hmm. Maybe make it from Shelley Duvall's character.
That was his sister, so that would be quite a different film.
Wait, that's Osmond's sister?
Osmond's sister. Shelley Duvall is Osmond's sister. Yeah.
Okay, I missed that.
Countess
okay.
Jemini.
All right, well.
She's in a scene, and then she leaves, and this is before Osmond and Isabel are married, and he says, "How do you like my sister?"
Okay, I missed that too. All right, fine. Well,
initially I thought, so his daughter is also in that scene, and initially I thought that his daughter was his sister. Mm-hmm. But I did eventually put the pieces together that Shelley Duvall is the sister. And that's why she knows that that child isn't his wife's.
Yeah, Shelley Duvall, I think, does a pretty good job in the movie, doing kind of a classic Shelley Duvall thing as an unstable woman who refuses not to express herself at all times.
Yeah, she's pretty campy. I think she gets to play campier than she normally does. And I think they aged her up, or maybe she's aged up, older than... I mean, this is 96. So it is 15 years after The Shining and the Woody Allen film she was in.
Sure.
So she is older.
I think it's interesting to compare her character in this to her character in Three Women.
Which I haven't seen.
Okay, well, she definitely...
Should we put it on the list? What's the double feature for Three Women?
That's a good question. I think it was remade recently.
Interesting.
I don't remember.
Yeah, there's something in my brain putting like Jessica Lange in there or something.
Yeah, I believe that might be right. I think she's one of the more alive characters. Mm-hmm. And even though she is a bit of a caricature, a bit silly, she's the type of person who I think is actually a real person.
Yeah.
And not a person just saying words in a dialogue scene wearing a costume. Mm-hmm. I think the film should have leaned into a slightly campier sensibility. Mm-hmm. I think that's part of what we're talking about. It's willing to show, in these flashes, people who have really strong feelings that are not just being sorrowful, but it doesn't actually invest in those ideas at all. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of just Nicole Kidman crying for a not clearly specified reason. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of dialogue in the movie which is people not answering each other's questions in a pointed way, which doesn't really add a lot to the viewing experience and could probably be left out. Maybe if we focus on the parts of the story where people did make clear statements about what they're thinking, about what they want, about what's going on, instead of constantly robing everything in veiled descriptions, I think it would have been a lot easier to watch.
So let's do a bit of script doctor here. One thing, that the ending is different in this film than it is in the book, and I might have included the final scene from the book. So the final scene in the movie is Rafe finally dies of tuberculosis. We're at his funeral. Isabel is crying. Viggo Mortensen's character, Mr. Goodwood, I hope I have that name right, who had known her in America and followed her over, renews his offer once again. They kiss. She isn't actively fighting it the whole time, but she definitely wasn't interested in the beginning, and it's unclear if she is actually persuaded during this fairly long make-out sequence, or if she's just like giving up. Then she runs away from him back to the house. Slow motion shot of her turning around outside the glass doors of the salon, and then fade to black. In the book, there is an additional scene where Goodwood, who is not a major character, shows up at the house the next day asking after Isabel. He's going to try one more time. And they discover that Isabel has gone back to Italy where her husband and stepdaughter lived. And it is left ambiguous as to whether she is giving in and just going to be miserable with Osmond, or if she's going to rescue her stepdaughter.
Yeah, both endings seem pretty ambiguous. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure if it matters which cliffhanger exactly we end on. I do think it's worth keeping the story with an unfinished story, unfinished ending, where the character is Miss Isabel Archer hasn't decided what she's going to do and hasn't figured it all yet.
And I feel like with Isabel, the story will either end on a cliffhanger whenever in her life it ends. It will either end on a cliffhanger or her death, because she seems fairly indecisive, either when she's 80 or now. I don't know how that would have happened. But, so there were... I'm getting a bewildered look from David. Ignore that. So there were several, like, threads that I think could have been more fully developed to actually give this film a theme. Because, as I said, I think the primary problem with the script is all of these things happen, but none of them add up to a message. And one thing that creates a problem for me, which is that I like, and I think narratives should establish expectations, which you can either fulfill or subvert. That's fine. But this film establishes no expectations. So a couple of threads that could have been developed. You could have leaned into the Dangerous Liaisons angle, which would be to have more scenes of Barbara Hershey and John Malkovich sort of evilly plotting to get this money from Isabel. I think kind of wherever we go for script doctoring this is going to involve more Barbara Hershey.
Why not?
Yeah. Because I think there is a version of this story in which Serena is the main character. And the story is they become friends before Isabel's uncle dies and before Isabel inherits her money. So I thought at the beginning that they genuinely were friends. So Serena and Isabel are genuinely friends. Then Serena learns that Isabel has inherited a lot of money and is rich. And she says, oh, I've got this daughter that I want to be supported. I'm going to get my ex-lover, the father, to marry Isabel so that my daughter can be supported. And it's like heart-wrenching for her to do this to her friend because she knows that Osmond is terrible, but she decides to put her daughter above that. That's an interesting story, which is occasionally hinted at during this film.
Yeah, we do get a sequence towards the end where she expresses regret for ruining Isabel's life, and that's not really set up at all early in the film. Yeah. She's just portrayed as this manipulative person with a scheme to get the money.
I thought it was really hard to figure out when people were lying and when they weren't due to this failure to set up expectations. The other time I noticed this was with Warburton's character. So we see Warburton at the beginning. He does the initial proposal that Isabel rejects because he's too stuffy. And then I kind of thought maybe we were done with him. But he does show up later after Isabel is married and she's living in Rome. And expresses that he is interested in Isabel's stepdaughter, Pansy, who we know is already in love with Christian Bale's character, who is not fancy enough for her father.
Again, that part mirrors Dangerous Liaisons quite well.
Yeah. Christian Bale is the Keanu Reeves.
He is the Keanu Reeves of The Portrait of a Lady.
But we later find out that Warburton isn't actually interested in Pansy. He just wants to be around Isabel and thinks that he can have an affair with her, thinks that he can convince her to divorce her husband, just wants to be next to her. It's really unclear what his desire is there. And it's not until that is directly stated that I could really process that. What he's telling us, and we have no reason to have him be like set up as a scheming villain, is that he wants to marry Pansy.
Yeah, it's not even clearly stated, I think, in the movie that he's really there for Isabel, although that's a very natural assumption.
I think another character, either Isabel's American friend or Serena or maybe Isabel's aunt, says he actually wants to be, or maybe it's Rafe, says, oh, it's a kitty, says that he's only pursuing Pansy to be around you.
Yeah, Isabel's friend, played by Mary Louise Parker, who is the sort of so-modern woman. She has a job working as a reporter. She wears glasses in New York. Yeah. She's there, and I do think we get the impression that she is there with these different suitors, partially because they're trying to maybe get Isabel for themselves, but fundamentally I think because they're trying to get her away from Osmond. And they're all getting ready to leave Italy, where Osmond is living, and they're like, come with us. This is your chance to get out of there. Isabel at first says no, then she decides to leave, and she tries to get Pansy to leave, and then after she leaves, she hears that
Rafe is dying.
She hears that Rafe is dying.
Or no, that's why she leaves.
That's right. She leaves because she hears Rafe is dying, but then we hear that she is maybe going to go back to Italy. So I think the goal there is to seduce her or to woo her, but also definitely to get her away from Osmond.
I also think that we really need to clarify, even if it is a misdirect, the nature of Pansy, because I had a huge question about her existence as someone who reads a lot of Victorian novels that just never got addressed. So I kind of assumed the default, but then they were like, oh no, it's not actually that. And I was like, well, you didn't create any expectation for me to subvert here. So we get introduced to Pansy as Osmond's daughter. We have no information, and she lives in a convent. She's not living with him. We have no information about Osmond having a previous wife. Mm-hmm. We don't find that out until like the fourth to last scene when Shelley Duvall tells us that who Pansy's mother really is.
Well, Pansy's mother is not his wife.
Right, exactly.
Right.
But they don't tell us anything. We don't hear any information about Pansy's mother. And we also don't know that Osmond had a previous wife. So initially I was thinking, she's living at a convent, she's not living with him, with her father. So I assumed that she is his natural daughter, as they would say, that she is illegitimate. And the film never says anything to contradict this. Then I see he's like throwing parties for her. She's very much involved in his life. He introduces her to his new wife, which if you have an illegitimate child, it was considered, rude at the very least to associate someone you're actually married to, your marital family, with them. So it was like, oh, Pansy must not be illegitimate. Osmond had a first wife that we just haven't heard about, and she's a legitimate child. Then it turns out, no, double wrong again. He was actually having an affair with Barbara Hershey's character, which we know. They tell us that they had been having an affair, or at least lead us to believe.
Isabel doesn't know that.
Isabel doesn't know that, but we have scenes of them alone. And actually, Serena is Pansy's mother, and she is illegitimate, but he's been kind of passing her off as the daughter of his first wife. Any information about that prior to the very end would have been good to know. Yeah,
it's not a very shocking or gut-wrenching reveal because we don't have any opinion about it before.
Right.
And I don't think the whole legitimate, illegitimate thing plays as strong to a modern audience anyway. Mm-hmm. So it's just not that tantalizing of a bait.
You can make it so by showing that it's important to the characters. Mm-hmm.
I think fundamentally the film has to be fixed by taking things out.
Yeah.
I wonder if the story, the story of Isabel trying to save Pansy and trying to help Pansy unite with Christian Bale, I don't actually think that's particularly interesting to the story.
It also doesn't get resolved.
Yeah.
Plot thread fully gets dropped.
So I guess I just wonder, what is this movie about? If the movie's about, well, this is a really interesting character, and she's a woman who isn't totally sure if she fits in the time that she's living, that's an interesting story. And then we can just sort of see her go through all of these episodes in adventure and try to express herself individually as she's going through all this. But that's not true.
Yeah, I feel like with this story, I wanted either Serena or Rafe to be the main character. I didn't get any of this extremely interesting character study from Isabel.
Yeah, Isabel is presented as a pretty stock standard costume drama woman who appears to be motivated mainly by modesty more than anything else. And so it's not that interesting just to watch her go around and talk to people. So the story maybe needs to be more centered around some type of action. There has to be some event that this story is about. At first we're really told it's going to be about Serena getting Osmond to seduce Isabel. Mm-hmm.
And maybe we think that because we've already seen Dangerous Liaisons.
Sure. Well, that's given this sort of a pretty sharp and stylistic delivery in the story right as we're sort of starting the second act. Mm-hmm. But that issue basically gets fast-forwarded, and we basically says, yes, he's convinced her. And then we're told that we have the second story, the relationship between Pansy and Rosier, Christian Bale's character. But that one also, we don't focus on that story very much at all. Yeah. We do see some interactions and some of their trouble, but there's not actually a driving narrative in the story. Yeah. And so if we have a relatively stock, bland character, and we just have a series of events that each more or less conclude without finale and don't really build onto each other, then it's not really clear what the movie's about.
Yeah. So some things it could have been about. You could have gone the Dangerous Liaisons route, as I said, and just have it be about, there's these two, sexually promiscuous, more mature cosmopolitan people who are tricking our nice American ingenue, and they're bad. Mm-hmm. It could have been a story about, from Rafe's perspective, where if you try to, even if you really try to do something nice for someone, because he's the one who told his uncle to leave her all this money, mm-hmm. it will end up backfiring, because mm-hmm. Isabella having this money makes her sad. Mm-hmm. It could be about, you can wander all around, but where you really want to be is back home. That would be the Thomas Hardy approach with the metaphor of the men.
We never see her at home.
Where her cousin's house. She really wants to be married to her cousin, and all of these other guys were a mistake. Relatedly, it could be about your sexuality will lead you astray, because we have sort of one seduction scene that Osmond does where he's grabbing and kissing. And she is maybe interested in this.
Moderately.
She certainly had this orgy fantasy earlier.
Yeah.
So I was sort of working on that, but then that storyline gets dropped.
Yep.
That potential arc gets dropped 40 minutes in. It could have been about the experience of being in an abusive marriage, mm-hmm. and trying to, save yourself. Like, to what extent can you save yourself when you're also trying to save someone else in that family?
Right. It's like 10% about all of those things.
Right. And just please pick one and elaborate.
Yeah, because we never really know what it is that Isabel found so interesting about Osmond in the first place, mm-hmm. when she ends up being very dissatisfied in the relationship, it's hard to understand why she's so surprised, and actually makes it almost hard to feel sorry for her, mm-hmm. because as far as we can tell, even in his seduction, he's playing the Dangerous Liaisons character where he's actually quite callous and kind of gross about it. So
it's very obvious to the audience that he's a bad choice. So it's slightly frustrating that it's not at all obvious to Isabel that he's a bad choice.
The fact that he continues to be callous and gross after they're married mm-hmm. doesn't really seem like a surprise. Mm-hmm. And I thought you were into that, Nicole Kidman. I don't know.
Do you feel like we've gone around in circles on this film enough?
Probably.
Okay, let's move on to a better film, Dangerous Liaisons. David, how is this received?
So, Dangerous Liaisons is based on a play by Christopher Hampton.
That's not true. Oh, it is based on a play.
Yes, it is.
It's based on a novel, which is based on a play.
Fair enough.
Okay.
As Livy mentioned earlier, it's based on a novel, an 18th century novel, a French novel, that was very groundbreaking and controversial for its time.
Yeah.
In its direct portrayal of sexual impropriety.
I would actually say that that's not that uncommon for the 18th century. Mm-hmm. I think the modern perspective of every time period before 1830 has been tainted by the Victorians, mm-hmm. partly because history became a really intense academic study during the Victorian period, and also because as we go backwards in time, we see people getting more prudish throughout the 20th and 19th centuries. And so we assume that people in the 18th century were even more prudish. But that is not the case. The early modern period was libertine and lush. So there is a lot about there are a lot of 18th century novels about sexual impropriety. And I've read quite a few Georgian novels, which are English novels from the 18th and early 19th century. Jane Austen is a Georgian writer. And let me tell you, reading Georgian novels really gives you a strong appreciation for Jane Austen, because she was such a better writer than pretty much everybody else that was her contemporary. So it wasn't, by any means the most salacious thing that anyone had ever read when it came out in, I think, 1782. I gotta say, I haven't read any other French novels of the era. It is hands down the best 18th century novel that I have read. Mm-hmm. And it is an epistolary novel, so that's why there's a big obsession with letters in the film, because it was originally just a collection of letters. Because in these early novels, they sort of felt the need to justify their existence.
Yeah, the found footage effect a little bit. Yeah.
Most early novels, they felt like the readers wouldn't accept that you were just reading a fictional story. And one of the biggest 18th century English novels, Pamela, was originally written as a manual on how to write letters. So that's sort of the atmosphere that the novel is coming out of.
And I've seen it grouped with other works where they're trying to take a more anti-aristocratic tone, sort of decrying the crimes of the nobility and trying to sort of be more upfront about the abusive relationship there.
Yes, the book is pretty deliberately trying to show what awful and abusive people these two aristocrats are.
So this book was adapted into a play by Christopher Hampton in 1985. And Christopher Hampton's a very well-received playwright and screenplay author. He wrote the Sunset Boulevard musical. Mm-hmm. He's the screenwriter of Atonement, which is another good film from the mid-2000s. And he's written several films for Stephen Frears before. Mary Riley, which is a Frankenstein adaptation, and another erotic thriller, Secret Agent. It was shot on this film was shot on a $14 million budget. It was shot on location in the Ile-de-France. During the production, John Malkovich had an affair with Michelle Pfeiffer that ended his 6-year marriage.
You don't say.
So this is more of a method piece. John Malkovich does not identify as a method actor, and he's actually been quite upfront about that. So no excuses there. It was released in December 1988, and it was considered financially successful. It made $34.7 million globally, so doubled its budget. And it was a critical success and to some extent a social phenomenon. It was nominated for a lot of Oscars, including Best Picture. Glenn Close was nominated for Best Actress. Michelle Pfeiffer was nominated for Supporting Actress. Christopher Hampton won his first Oscar for the screenplay, which he wrote. So the writer of the play also wrote the screenplay. It won for art direction, for costume design, and for score. Also did well at the BAFTAs. Michelle Pfeiffer won there. That all makes
sense to me.
Christopher Hampton won again for screenplay, and it got a lot of other nominations. The Portrait of a Lady has a 48% on Rotten Tomatoes. This film has a 94% on Rotten Tomatoes. So it's a much better received film. And it definitely permeated the cultural conscious. Yeah. There's a well-known French and Saunders parody, which is pretty good, worth checking out. John Malkovich appeared as the same character in an Annie Lennox music video.
Yes.
With
Broken Glass.
Walking on Broken Glass. With Hugh Laurie reprising effectively his role from Blackadder Season 3.
Blackadder Season 3, yeah, the Prince.
So
Regents.
The two major costume drama characters of the time
exactly
united in an Annie Lennox music video. So if that's what you want, it's out there.
And do you think it's fair to say that this is the defining John Malkovich character other than himself in being John Malkovich?
I would say that's true. I'll leave the cultural analysis to you there. It's a good question. I think it's probably his second most well-known role, but to modern audience, John Malkovich as John Malkovich is so dominant it's difficult to compare to anything else.
Malkovich.
That's right.
That one's also on the list.
Stuart Craig, who won the Oscar for art direction, is also the art director for a lot of other successful movies. Gandhi, The English Patient, all of the Harry Potter movies. So, same guy there. And then James, I'm going to call him James Atchison, but it might be James Akeson. I genuinely don't know. Who did the costume design, also did lots of really successful movies. Worked with Monty Python on The Meaning of Life. And then went on to work with Terry Gilliam in Time Bandits in Brazil, and with Terry Jones in The Wind of the Willows. He did Highlander, Man in the Iron Mask, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. So a lot of very capable people. This was clearly a film that wanted to bring in top-tier talent when it came to production.
Yeah, and the production design is fantastic. It's extremely beautiful to look at. The sets, the costumes are very historically accurate, and at the beginning, the first sequence is of our heroes getting dressed, and we see all of the various layers of clothing, makeup, and hair being applied. And from an accuracy perspective, I have to say everything is almost perfect. They do put Michelle Pfeiffer in this sort of high-collared, sheer, I don't even know what to call it, which is not the sort of item that would have been worn, but they're trying. I do understand why it's there. It's to show that she's a very modest, genteel woman, whereas other women have V-neck kerchiefs going into their dress.
A lot of focus visually is put on the makeup that characters are wearing, because of course this is a time where both men and women are wearing makeup maybe made out of materials that aren't particularly good for them,
Yeah.
but they're putting on a lot of it. And the film starts and roughly ends with pictures, shots, sequences of Glenn Close putting on her makeup very carefully.
Or taking it off.
Showing how she has to sort of put on a mask to the world, partially because she knows that's just the nature of society, that she has to play the game, and partially because she is such a villainous character that were anyone to see who she truly was, she knows the reaction she will eventually get. The Dangerous Liaison has been adapted into a film many, many different times.
All from... the play was written right before the film.
Yes.
Or shortly before the film. So these other ones are not based on the Hampton play.
You're right. The Liaisons Dangereuses has been adapted into a film several times.
Les Liaisons Dangereuses.
Thank you so much. It was adapted into French cinemas a couple different times by Roger Vadim in the 50s and 60s. And shortly after this movie was made, a sort of...
oh, that's right.
more modern interpretation was released. Valmont, starring
Annette Bening, Colin Firth.
That's right. Meg Tilly. And was later remade as Cruel Intentions.
The high school version?
I guess they're in high school. Yes, I believe it's an elite private high school. Yes. Recently, there was a Chinese and Korean version that came out.
Yeah, I've seen some of the Chinese version.
Yeah, I've seen the Korean version, Untold Scandal, not a bad film. Partially, there's a lot of demand, I think, for this anti-aristocratic feeling there, and to sort of show how those on top of society are those that are corrupt. It's definitely a strong theme.
Yeah, so we've talked about how very elite and elevated it is, but I think a big thing about this film is how campy it is. The Marquise de Merteuil and the Vicomte de Valmont are almost cartoonish villains, and that in the novel they are intended to be over the top, Don Juan cartoonish villains.
Yes.
Who get their just desserts. One of the biggest changes from the original novel to the play and then to the film is the ending for the Marquise.
What happens to the Marquise in the novel?
In the novel, okay. So first of all, she does worse things in the novel. In the book, in the film, she issues a challenge to the Vicomte to seduce and, if necessary, rape a teenage girl who is engaged to the Marquise's ex-lover, and who dumped her ignominiously or ungraciously. So she wants his future wife to be ruined. So that's not very nice. And she's also perfectly willing to encourage him in his pursuit of Madame de Tourvel, this virtuous wife that he wants to corrupt. So it just to cover the characters again, the Marquise de Merteuil and the Vicomte de Valmont are ex-lovers who are still kind of friends. The Marquise has a cousin, Madame de Volanges, who has a daughter, Cécile de Volanges, and then the Vicomte has an aunt, Madame de Rosemonde, who is a friend and has invited to her country estate, Madame de Tourvel, while Monsieur de Tourvel is off being a military person somewhere else. And the Marquise in the film is mainly guilty of this manipulation towards Cécile, of sleeping with Danceny, who is a much younger man who is in love with Cécile, and she's kind of saying that she will help set them up, but also in the meantime, why don't you sleep with me? So that's kind of heartless, but not evil, her situation with Danceny. And then I think it's perfectly fair to call what she's doing to Cécile evil. She also is very deceitful with Cécile, pretending to be her friend, meanwhile sort of pushing her into Valmont's arms. In the novel, there's also an undercurrent, which is never directly stated, and I think possibly couldn't have been directly stated at the time, that she is on trial for something, that there's a long, drawn-out trial, which, if you put all the pieces together, appears to be her sexual abuse of two small children. And at the end of the novel, Valmont, with his dying breath, gives Danceny all of the letters that she'd been writing and that make up much of the novel, revealing her crimes. which he publishes, and then all of Paris hates her. In the novel, she also gets syphilis, or possibly syphilis that she already has becomes manifest. She loses an eye and gets socially kicked out of the country and has to move to the Netherlands. The worst fate possible.
Who could bear it?
It's hard to say if she is worse than Valmont or not. I think the novel is kind of leaning on her being worse than Valmont. She directly does fewer bad things. Valmont actually rapes a teenager. But she certainly is encouraging him to do all of these bad things. And Valmont, in both the film and the novel, does kind of seem to get a redemption, some element of redemption at the end. He genuinely falls in love with Madame de Tourvel, and the way that he has treated her destroys him, and he kind of just lets Danceny kill him.
Yeah, he's kind of redeemed in that he gives up and lets someone murder him, which is a type of redemption.
He feels bad for what he has done. But in the novel, it doesn't really seem like the Marquise feels bad for what she has done. She experiences only external punishment because she refuses to experience internal punishment, which at least in the 18th century would make her seem worse than Valmont. And I think in the 18th century, they also considered rape to be less of a crime than it is now. So Valmont, I think, would have seemed less bad than her.
Yeah, it seems like in the movie, Valmont is probably the more evil character. And Glenn Close is definitely despicable and manipulative, but is much more indirect in whatever evil deeds that she's up to.
And they make it more clear that she's really in love with Valmont. And a lot of this is just an expression of how miserable she is. And then in the final sequence, the final sequence is 3 different scenes all about closure for Glenn Close's character. We see her hysterically weeping and like tearing at her skin when she learns that Valmont is dead. We see her getting booed out of the opera. And then we see her tragically wiping the makeup off of her face, which is a way more sympathetic portrayal than she gets in the book. So I think, maybe this is a tie it has to Portrait of a Lady. This is presenting a more feminist angle than the novel was. Because the novel is mainly about aristocrats are terrible and the men and women are equally terrible. Whereas the film is saying aristocrats are terrible, these 2 people are terrible. But Glenn Close leads a very circumscribed life that she has so little to do and so little control.
Valmont has this famously terrible reputation that he's always talking about throughout the film, but he doesn't actually seem that bothered by it. It's not really a big deal to him. Whereas the Marquise, Glenn Close's character, is very guarded about her reputation and very concerned about what people think of her. And that's why all of these things being revealed at the end are so devastating to her and basically destroy her life.
Yeah. And in the cinematography, everyone except the Marquise is given a lot more liberty by the framing. So there's only one shot of her outside. She's going from a carriage into a house. Every other shot of her is indoors. I think the first 3 scenes that we see with her, she is in her own house. And shots of her tend to have the back wall fairly close to her. And we don't get as many wide shots, partially because we're inside for all of them. But most of the other characters at some point get portrayed in a wide shot. Less so Uma Thurman's character, Cecile. But all of the other ones do get outdoor wide shots.
The film opens with these really close shots of John Malkovich and Glenn Close. I think sort of trying to represent the epistolary, the letter writing part, where whenever they're talking directly to each other, we bring the camera in right up on their face, often switching on a direct face close-up back and forth between the 2 characters to sort of allow them to express maximally to the character, bring some of that campy energy that you're talking about, but also sort of make clear that this is this direct message from one to the other that's sort of laying down the spine of the story. One of the things I really like about the way it starts, and I think that makes the film successful, is that we jump into the action right away. We have this dressing scene a little bit to establish the setting, but within the first 5 or 10 minutes, we have the core story introduced.
Yeah.
Glenn
and
Close,
I think the opening scene is to really show the extent to which they are being weighted on hand and foot. They are they are not even putting their own clothes on.
Yeah, and it's not something that they seem to be taking any actual real joy or appreciation out of. This is just the mechanical way in which they live their lives, supported by the servants. But yeah, we quickly jump into the core plot of the story and tell the audience what it's about. Glenn Close wants John Malkovich to seduce Uma Thurman. John Malkovich is interested in Michelle Pfeiffer more. And we get to hear those things.
And also, they want to have sex with each other, but won't allow themselves to.
Yeah, Glenn Close's interest in John Malkovich seems very uncertain. And maybe she wants to have sex with him, but maybe she really doesn't. I'm not convinced that she's actually in love with him for the whole story.
It's extremely obvious that she is. I mean, it's not established in the first scene, but it's established in maybe the third or fourth scene that she's in and is meant to be viewed retrospectively.
So we get introduced to these four characters and this core dynamic between them right away in the story. And we stay focused on these four people and this dynamic from beginning to end. And there are other things going on. We learn about Darshini a bit later, but even Keanu Reeves' character, the Chevalier de Darshini, Danceny, he's introduced in the first 10 minutes of the movie as well. And the role that he's going to play is established. So I think, unlike some costume dramas, which can put off people that aren't already familiar with the story, the actual people that you need to keep track of and what their core relationships are communicated very explicitly and very clearly at the beginning of the movie, and we're able to work within that dynamic for the whole runtime.
Yeah.
To some extent, this means that we don't exactly what everyone's motivations aren't that clearly established, and there is some ambiguity about exactly why does everyone do the things they want to do. Why is it we only get a few sort of throwaway lines explaining why the Marquise and the Vicomte are so desperate to have this revenge and make Cecile into their pawn. But we're just asked to sort of accept that as a given and to work with that in the story. In some adaptations, like in Valmont, there's a lot of setup work there where we get to have more of the environment around it and we get to sort of dig more into the characters' motivations. And that can make for an interesting story, but I think that means that those other adaptations have to be flatter and less stylized, and we have less interesting action to that really engross us in what's going on. And this, because the core structure of the narrative is kept simple and kept direct, we're able to have a lot of fun with it and to indulge ourselves into exploring every nook and cranny.
And with these sort of intimate close-ups that we get of the four main characters, the physically intimate close-ups of the camera, seeing them in their undress, that sort of situation, it makes us so that we are willing to be invested in things that they are invested in. So, I don't think we need this whole explanation of why they need to get revenge on Bastide, the Marquise's ex.
I don't know that he ever is shown on screen.
He's never shown on screen.
Yeah.
They just talk about him.
Yeah. I really liked how the film included the setting and the set design so much in establishing the characters and bringing in the aesthetic of the culture that they're living in. There's a lot of scenes in the opera, and going to the opera and listening to the operas sort of becomes part of the plot, where that's how Cecile is able to sort of escape her mother's supervision and get involved in some of these games.
The aria Ombre mai fu from Circe is a theme that comes up a couple of times.
What's that aria? Tell us about it.
Approximately the translation from the Italian is, "What a great tree." It's from the opera Circe by Handel. Circe is Xerxes, the emperor of Persia. This aria is the very first thing that happens in the opera, which is a bit of an unusual structure. And he's singing about the comfort he gets from this plane tree. But then the rest of the opera is about how he manipulates his brother and the woman his brother loves so that he can marry the brother's girlfriend, and then how he is exposed at the end. But we actually kind of end up with a happy ending anyway.
So another tale of sexy aristocratic intrigue, is that fair?
Yeah, maybe the correct double feature is Circe and Dangerous Liaisons.
Get on it, film producers. You've been challenged, Hollywood.
And And I talked about this film being camp several times. And now I want to go all the way back to the beginning of the podcast when I mentioned that my title for this series is One Scene Makes All the Difference. Mm-hmm. So I think if you don't have... I think the scene of Glenn Close being booed at the opera really changes the whole film. And if you don't have that, then it's just a kind of campy... posh aristocrats, kind of sexy, but also kind of we don't like the sexiness. Costume drama with lots of cleavage and somewhat over the top acting. Glenn Close it seems like she's giving a really like serious performance, and she's getting all the Oscar noms. John Malkovich is being John Malkovich. He. I wasn't trying to reference the film, but oops, I did. He's doing a classic job of himself, and a lot of the scenes that he is playing, he is lying in them. And I think he tries to make a distinction for the audience between when he is lying and he's a little bit more campy.
Yeah, it's always interesting to see actors pretending in movies. Glenn Close is doing the same thing where she's pretending to be a bad liar in a way because when she's lying, it's always very clear. Yeah. But I know what you mean. And
then I would say Michelle Pfeiffer and Swoosie Kurtz's performances are fine. The two younger people are maybe struggling with the material. Uma Thurman and Keanu Reeves don't seem super comfortable with their roles or the text, or maybe they're just being directed to play way younger than they are. But I would say these are not great performances, and it's easier to accept them in a campy environment than in a more serious environment. So this movie was almost fine. It was almost a fine, sexy romp with bad people. But adding that final scene brings it together to maybe be more than the sum of its parts. And that's the kind of scene that I wish we had had in Portrait of a Lady. I kept being strung along in Portrait of a Lady, being like, why does this matter? What's the actual point? And never being told what the actual point was. Whereas the actual point of Dangerous Liaisons is about, gosh, is it terrible to be a woman in the 18th century, and it doesn't matter how much money you have.
Yeah, that closing sequence with Glenn Close is really striking. And it's stuck with me ever since the first time I saw this movie. And it's not only has a strong message that it's delivering, but it's really visually engrossing to look at. The swooping shot around the opera as people are booing, and contrasted with the close-up of her slowly peeling the makeup off her face.
And that's her most intense makeup look in the whole film.
You can feel her screaming into the mirror if you can't hear her doing it. I'm not sure that adding something like that would have made that much of a difference in Portrait of a Lady or The Portrait of a Lady, because there isn't a strong dynamic to try to resolve with this outpouring of emotion. To some extent, the film tries to do that with Nicole Kidman having several of these big crying scenes late in the film to sort of express her despair. But it's not clear why she made the decisions that led her to be there, or even what she really wants in order to resolve it.
So there was one really interesting moment in Portrait of a Lady that we haven't talked about yet. It's towards the end. It's after Isabel has found out that Pansy is illegitimate and was Serena's daughter. But Serena finds out that Isabel knows and goes to talk to her. And we get an interior shot. Isabel is standing facing away, and Serena sort of does a little bit to explain the situation. We cut back to the back of Nicole Kidman, and then the scene ends. And I was shocked that we didn't get to see a confrontation between them. I think if we had seen a confrontation between them, then that could have established the plot as being about Serena having to choose between her daughter's welfare and her friend's welfare, and being apologetic for what she had done to Isabel, and thus establishing sort of the secondary narrative as being about what it's like to be in an abusive relationship. But it just mysteriously cut.
Yeah, I think The Portrait of a Lady also fails to bring in a strong cultural sensibility. And I don't think Dangerous Liaisons, the film, is particularly focused on social issues. I think the aristocratic concerns are part of the movie, but that's actually a lot downplayed compared to my impression of the novel.
And they're not super relatable now because we don't. We arguably have an aristocracy, but they're certainly different than the Ancien Regime aristocracy.
Yeah, well, hopefully modern audiences are more aware of that. The problem with the aristocracy is not that they're sexually free. That's not the problem. But, one of the things that I think Jane Campion does sometimes struggle with in her movies is to have respect and interest for the people who are not the upper to middle class white people that the story is about. Mm-hmm. In the travel series, everyone who's not from England or the United States is presented as kind of weird and annoying. There's part of what's supposed to, in the preface to...
Which is especially interesting because she is not from England or the United States.
Sure. Well, we didn't get a chance to see her opinion of Australians in that film, but that would have been interesting.
She's Kiwi.
That's true. In the preface to The Portrait of a Lady, Henry James talks about how a lot of the story for him is about bringing the feeling of living in Italy to the reader and describing what it's like to live in this bustling, loud culture and how that's actually enlivening and interesting.
I didn't get bustling and loud from The Portrait of a Lady.
Yeah, The Portrait of a Lady, the Italians are there basically as comic relief.
I can't name a single Italian character in that film.
There are no Italian characters, but there are several shots and sequences of Italian people yelling at each other in Italian, effectively played for comic relief. There are lots of sequences of beggar children walking around and bothering these people. And it's actually a very dismissive way to portray these foreign or exotic places and people. And so it seems less interested in talking about the social issues and the cultural issues that are there in the source material, I think to its detriment.
Jumping back fully to Portrait of a Lady, I think I started to touch on this, but they clearly put a lot of work into the sets. They're very heavily and eclectically dressed, and they seem, the eclecticism makes it seem realistic, like all of these items were gathered over a period of time. The couch doesn't exactly match the wallpaper, and there's a chair that doesn't exactly match the couch. And it makes it feel lived in, but also no space felt particular. So one thing I really struggled with in Portrait of a Lady was knowing whose house we were in. And in Dangerous Liaisons, it's quite important whose house we are in. And there is probably about a similar number of locations in the two films. But in Dangerous Liaisons, they feel very different. There's the convent scenes. There's the more closed scenes in the Marquise's townhouse. There's the open scenes of the outdoors at Madame de Rosamond's, where a lot of time we'll have an open door or at least a glass door that we can see outside of. And I feel like if you are putting so much work into creating these spaces in Portrait of a Lady, more work needed to be done to associate the characters with the spaces that they've created. And possibly there just wasn't enough substance to any of the characters to create particular aesthetics.
Yeah, I think, to recap on The Portrait of a Lady, the issue is that the film is about her being a victim of the men controlling her lives, whereas the book is about her messing things up for herself, despite her idealistic and good intentions. And I just think
she states her idealism initially, but we don't see it.
Yeah, we don't spend a lot of time focusing on that, and she comes across as a very flat and reserved person who's not that interested in engaging with anything until she suddenly gets interested in Osmond. And in Roger Ebert's review, he was talked about how in the book, which he was a big fan of, there is a big emphasis on why she gets interested in Osmond and how she's really interested in him as an artist. But in the film, there's no plausibility actually given to that relationship. And so the idea behind Barbara Hershey's attempt to manipulate him becomes just a thing that she does. It's not actually something that's based on anything that's going on.
We will close by answering the question, did we watch these films in the right order? And now I have to really ask myself what that question means. There's the literal meaning of that question. However, what the question actually means is, what order should you, dear listener, watch these movies in? I have to say the answer is watch Dangerous Liaisons twice. Or watch Dangerous Liaisons and then watch the Annie Lennox music video, Walking on Broken Glass. Because the only group of people that I can recommend Portrait of a Lady to is aspiring screenwriters who want to know what not to do.
Cold.
It's not a good movie.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question maybe would best say, if you're going to watch these two movies, what order do we recommend other people watch them in? And I would say the answer is the reverse order that we watch them in. Dangerous Liaisons is the better movie, so that's the one that you really want to watch. And then the Portrait
If you're going to die in the middle of this marathon, it's better to have seen Dangerous Liaisons than to have seen Portrait of a Lady.
I think the Portrait of a Lady is interesting to compare it to Dangerous Liaisons. And that's one of the most interesting things to do in the film, because both in John Malkovich's character and in several points in the way that it's shot and the way the dialogue is delivered, it's clearly referencing Dangerous Liaisons. So it makes more sense to see them with that connection in mind. And I would say that's quite possibly true for the source material as well. So, the Dangerous Liaisons was written before the Portrait of a Lady was. And it's quite possible that this dynamic in the novel is partially inspired by Dangerous Liaisons. Dangerous Liaisons is set earlier, and Portrait of a Lady is about the preceding or the following century. So I think it makes total sense to say Dangerous Liaisons first and the Portrait of a Lady second. I think that's clearly the right order. Yeah, I would say do Dangerous Liaisons, dig into that, enjoy it, and see Portrait of the Lady as a type of extended commentary on Dangerous Liaisons. It's only going to get you through the first half of the movie, because the second half is not actually that connected and not as interesting.
Yeah. If you're trying to do this both in one evening, Portrait of a Lady is one that it's perfectly fine to sort of fall asleep during.
Yeah, whenever you want to give up on the Portrait of a Lady, go ahead and give up. That's fine. You did it. You watched the movie. You got kind of the bit. You saw the interesting Jane Campion gimmicks in the first
hour,
half.
You go to bed.
Those are the interesting parts.
Yeah.
So I would say Dangerous Liaisons, then Walking on Broken Glass, maybe watch the French and Saunders episode.
And now it is a month later, and we are back, hopefully sounding refreshed, to tell you about next episode, which is going to be the triple feature. Once a year, but nobody knows when, because it's just whatever month we think will be least busy. We have 3 movies that we think go especially well together, as opposed to just 2. So, David, what are the 3 movies of the 2024 triple feature?
We are doing Amadeus from 1984, The Prestige from 2006, and Black Swan from 2010.